April 18, 1945. The Ruhr Pocket, Western Germany. More than 500,000 battle-hardened soldiers, men who had fought from Stalingrad to Normandy, made an unthinkable decision. They surrendered en masse to American forces instead of continuing to fight. What the Americans had unleashed was not just superior firepower. It was something far more devastating, a systematic approach to war that made resistance not only useless, but irrational. April 4, 1945. The encirclement was complete. Field Marshal Walter Model, commander of Army Group B, studied maps that told an impossible story. In just 12 days, American armored spearheads had achieved what German military doctrine considered operationally impossible: the complete encirclement of an entire army group. Over 430,000 men, trapped in a pocket barely 80 kilometers wide. But the numbers weren't what made this unprecedented. German forces had been encircled before, at Stalingrad, and in countless battles on both fronts. What made the Ruhr Pocket different was what happened next. There would be no desperate breakout attempts, no last-stand suicides, no fanatical resistance. Instead, over the next 2 weeks, the largest mass surrender in the history of the Western Front unfolded, revealing something that terrified the German High Command more than any weapon. Their soldiers had stopped believing in resistance. The Americans called their approach vertical envelopment. But that clinical term masked a revolution in combined arms warfare. Major General J. Lawton Collins had developed a system that didn't just defeat German positions, it made defending them psychologically impossible. Army Group B contained veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had survived Kursk and Kiev, soldiers who knew how to fight their way out of encirclement. And yet, within days, entire divisions surrendered without firing a single shot. By April 18th, when Model dissolved Army Group B, more than 317,000 had already laid down their arms. Final counts exceeded 325,000, with estimates suggesting total captures surpassed 500,000, including all attached units across the Ruhr industrial region. What the Germans faced was not a conventional military force. It was an integrated system of destruction, operating on principles they had never encountered before. The Americans had developed a fundamental evolution in warfare, the ability to make continued resistance not just difficult or costly, but functionally meaningless. The weapon wasn't a single piece of technology. It was the perfect integration of air power, armor, artillery, logistics, and psychological operations into one machine. A machine that wore down not only Germany's ability to fight, but its will to fight. In his final message, Model wrote, "The Americans do not fight battles, they fight industrial organizations. Our men are not facing an army, but a system. Courage means nothing when the enemy can predict your every move, respond to your every action, and make your position untenable before you even occupy it." 3 weeks later, Model walked into the forest and took his own life. His men had already made their choice, not because they were cowards, but because they had recognized a truth their commanders refused to see. The Americans had created a form of warfare where traditional military virtues, courage, tactical skill, determination, had become irrelevant. The German military doctrine that failed so catastrophically had been born from success. For 5 years, the Wehrmacht had conquered an entire continent using speed, concentration of force, and tactical flexibility. Its concept of Auftragstactik, mission-type tactics, allowed commanders at every level to achieve objectives through their own initiative. German soldiers were extensively trained. Even the most basic infantry received education that emphasized independent thinking. This system had worked brilliantly, from Poland to France, and throughout the early Russian campaigns. By 1943, despite mounting losses, German tactical doctrine still produced impressive results. At the Kasserine Pass in February 1943, relatively small German forces inflicted humiliating defeats on American units. The Germans had demonstrated that superior tactics and veteran leadership could overcome material disadvantage. General Dwight D. Eisenhower was forced to restructure American training and doctrine after Kasserine. But the Germans made a critical miscalculation. They assumed that the war would continue to be decided by tactical engagements, that battles would still be won by better trained soldiers making better decisions. What they didn't understand was that the Americans were not trying to win tactical engagements. They were building a system, one that would make tactical excellence itself irrelevant. Between 1943 and 1945, the U.S. Army underwent a transformation unmatched in military history. By early 1945, American forces in Western Europe were supported by a logistics network delivering 26,000 tons of supplies every day. Each division crossing the Rhine had artillery support capable of firing more tonnage in 1 hour than an entire German corps could fire in a day. But logistics alone didn't explain the psychological collapse. The Soviets had enjoyed massive material superiority on the Eastern Front, yet German forces had continued to fight there with desperate determination. In Budapest, German troops resisted for 50 days. In Breslau, the garrison held out for 82 days. Against the Americans, that determination simply evaporated. The difference wasn't firepower, it was predictability and inevitability. American doctrine had evolved into what the Germans called Materialschlacht, the battle of material. The Americans had developed a systematic approach in which every German action triggered an overwhelming, pre-planned response. Artillery observers could call for fire missions within minutes. Air support appeared within an hour. Tank columns maneuvered to cut off retreat routes before German commanders even realized their positions were compromised. Colonel General Alfred Jodl wrote in March 1945, "Against the Americans, our tactical doctrine has become a prison. Every principle that once served us well now works against us. Our flexibility means nothing when the enemy has prepared responses for every option. We are fighting an opponent who doesn't need to outthink us. They have made thinking itself irrelevant." What the Americans unleashed against the Ruhr was not secret technology. It was the systematic operational integration of warfare refined into perfect synchronization. The true innovation lay in how each element functioned as part of a single, unified mechanism, developed by Lieutenant General Omar Bradley's staff during the winter of 1944. American P-38 Lightning reconnaissance planes flew grid patterns over the entire pocket at precise intervals. Photo interpreters received developed film within 2 hours, mapping every German position and movement. By studying movement patterns, American artillery would fire not where German troops were, but where they would be 30 minutes later. The psychological impact was immediate. German reports repeatedly used the word mysterious. Units that repositioned at night would find themselves under artillery fire at their new locations within hours. Supply columns that tried alternate routes found American fighter bombers already waiting at the crossroads. Colonel Edwin Luther's time-on-target method coordinated multiple artillery battalions, firing from different positions, synchronizing shells to strike simultaneously. A German position might see one ranging shot. Then within 5 seconds, dozens of shells from 6 directions would land all at once. But artillery was only the anvil. The hammer was operational tempo. American armored columns didn't attack German positions head-on. They bypassed them, guided by radio communications and aerial reconnaissance. U.S. commanders identified gaps in German lines within hours. Tank columns exploited those gaps before German reserves could respond. Lieutenant Carl Godem wrote on April 9th, "We are always responding to situations that have already changed. Our commanders make the right decisions for circumstances that no longer exist. By the time orders reach the front, the Americans have moved on. We fight yesterday's battle while they're already positioning for tomorrow's." April 12, 1945, the collapse began. What had started as tactical defeats transformed into a systemic breakdown. The breaking point wasn't a single battle. It was the growing realization that continued resistance served no purpose at all. The 9th Panzer Division provides the clearest example. On April 10th, the division reported full combat readiness with 47 operational tanks. By April 13th, after 3 days of attempted offensive action, Divisional Commander General Harold von Elverfeldt reported, "Every movement draws immediate artillery fire. Every concentration triggers an air attack. We cannot maneuver, we can only die in place or surrender." On April 15th, von Elverfeldt surrendered, with 38 operational tanks still intact and 2 days of ammunition remaining. When interrogated, he stated, "I did not surrender because we were defeated, but because fighting had become murder. I could achieve nothing except the death of my men." Psychological studies of surrendered German troops revealed common themes. Soldiers described a feeling of helplessness, unlike anything they had experienced on the Eastern Front. One sergeant told interrogators, "Against the Russians, a brave man could survive. Against the Americans, bravery only meant you died for nothing." The most devastating factor wasn't material superiority, it was methodical inevitability. American forces advanced on predictable schedules, moving forward exactly as far as their supply lines could support. Then they paused to consolidate. They didn't rush. They didn't take unnecessary risks. They offered no opportunities for counterattacks. They advanced like a machine, impersonal and unstoppable. German soldiers called it Walzenkrieg, the steamroller war. There was no glory, no opportunity for heroism, no way for courage or skill to matter. You couldn't ambush a steamroller. You couldn't outmaneuver it. You could only wait for it to reach you, and then either be crushed or step aside. By April 16th, American forces had processed over 150,000 prisoners. The infrastructure for handling surrenders became as sophisticated as the combat operations themselves. Prisoner processing stations operated on assembly line principles, efficient, relentless, dehumanizing. That very efficiency was demoralizing. Field Marshal Walter Model maintained communication until April 17th. His final orders authorized unit commanders to surrender if they judged continued resistance meaningless, effectively dissolving his command while refusing to formally capitulate. On April 21st, the last organized German resistance ceased. Final prisoner counts exceeded 325,000, the largest mass surrender in the history of the Western Front. American casualties throughout the entire operation, 10,000 wounded, 2,000 dead. German combat deaths around 10,000, the rest captured. The casualty ratio, which normally favored defenders in prepared positions, had been completely inverted. The Eastern Front provided a brutal contrast. In the Ruhr Pocket, 200,000 German soldiers resisted Soviet forces until the very end of the war, suffering over 150,000 casualties but never surrendering en masse. Against the Soviets, the Germans fought to literal annihilation. Against the Americans, they chose survival. Post-war studies identified the Ruhr Pocket as the moment when industrial warfare reached its logical conclusion. The Americans had created a system where human factors, courage, leadership, tactical skill, became operationally irrelevant. Not because German soldiers lacked those qualities, but because the American system had evolved beyond a level where such qualities could affect the outcome. General Eisenhower's final report stated, "The Ruhr operation demonstrated that industrial-age warfare, properly applied, can achieve decisive results with minimal friendly casualties. The key is the systematic integration of all combat arms, operating on a tempo that prevents any effective enemy response." The 500,000 German soldiers who surrendered had not been defeated in battle. They had been rendered obsolete by a form of warfare that no longer needed to defeat them, only to process them.